Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group. It is Saturday, the 18th of April, and you're joined by myself, Philip Nothard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson. So, Phil, we've just started the beginning of the next 3 weeks of lockdown.
Yeah, can't wait. Not. Yeah. You managed to get haircuts and things like that? Not yet. But,
No, don't.
No, I think I think it was probably. I think we were just talking before the recording there, Curtis, weren't we? That it felt that was going to happen. I think there was early signs coming out of Wales and Scotland had been talking as well, hadn't they? That I think the generally in conversations across the network that it feels like mid-May is the sort of restart time. If we've got a restart time, I think everybody's sort of focusing on that mid-May point. I don't think anybody expected that this weekend we were going to sort of lift the restrictions and start to open up things again. But in other countries they have done, haven't they, as we've seen this week?
And it's interesting to see how it's being treated in Italy with, it's a very sort of softly approach, isn't it? Sort of some shops are allowed to open, others aren't. Cafes and bars aren't allowed to open. So I'm sure the UK government is watching Italy very closely as a model.
Yeah, and it's difficult to compare things with Germany as well, isn't it? Because Germany were ahead in terms of that sort of vaccine side of things, weren't they? So they've obviously got they had a jump start on the testing procedures that we didn't have as well. So again, I don't think anybody expected that we were going to be open to lifted restrictions this weekend, and I think hopefully this next 3 weeks we can get control and start to think about lifting some restrictions and getting back to some kind of business. And we've got stories talking about that on today's podcast, haven't we? But it's kind of what that business will look like when we do start to lift restrictions.
Yeah, and of course, because of the lockdown, we've actually been busier than normal on Most Trade Radio, because we've got an interview this week with Nathan Tomlinson, who's the dealer principal and owner of Devonshire Motors down in Barnstable. So that will actually be added to the end of the show. So stay tuned for that. But recent interviews, the special interviews have included Robert Forrester, Darren Edwards, Mike Jones, and Umif Samani, and we've got more to follow next week.
We have, and we managed to squeeze the one with Sterling Moss as well from back in 2015. So again, what a legend and what a legacy he's left behind as well. So again, great interview there from Derek Blair, founder of the Motor Trade Radio podcast, and really open conversation there with Sir Sterling Moss as well. So if you've not listened to that, then head over to the website and tune in and have a listen to that, because a very open and frank conversation there with Sir Sterling Moss.
Yeah, you can actually tell. There's a lovely comment from Sterling Moss in it when Derek thanks him for coming on the show, and Sterling says, "Well, I've been talking about my favourite subject, me."
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and there's some lovely anecdotes, so definitely worth listening to. So headlines this week, we've got a fifth of consumers ready to buy cars immediately after the lockdown's lifted, according to some research here from What Car. We've got UK car finance groups reporting a surge in motorists seeking loan relief. Got an update on Car Gurus, and they're pulling out of some of their European businesses in Germany, Spain and Italy, and that's in response to the pandemic. Marshall's boss urges the spirit of lockdown. Vauxhall boss. Now, this is really interesting. I'm looking forward to talking about this one. But he's saying that the coronavirus pandemic will change car buying for good, We've also got the latest on OEM plant reopenings across Europe and further afield, and the car registrations across Europe from ASEA. So plenty to get through.
Just a bit. So we better head over to the first one, and as you say there, Curtis. A lot of people have been talking about this, and there's been a few webinars in recent weeks, and what will happen post lockdown and consumer buying behaviours and attitude towards ownership of vehicles. And this is the first one on AM Online, and as you say, a fifth of consumers to buy cars immediately after coronavirus lockdown. And this is some research, a survey that What Car have done. In the surveyed 3,000 active online car researchers and found that 18.82% said that they intend to buy their next car immediately after the lockdown restrictions have been lifted. So that's kind of a positive news for the sector, isn't it? That there is going to be this. We've got pent up demand and pent up volume that's sat there that couldn't be delivered, but actually potentially we could see an uplift in activity when we do exit this.
Yeah, it's a good positive story to start the show with. The research is actually really interesting. It's from the What Car Insights publication, which you can find online if you want to dig a bit deeper into the results. But the other results found that 36% of in-market buyers feel that retailers should respond to their online inquiries within 24 hours, and that's despite the ongoing crisis. And a further 13% expect contact within half that time, and 6% of these buyers want it within an hour. Now, this kind of resonates with the interview that we'll have at the end of the show with Nathan, and indeed comments from Darren Edwards last week from Sitner, that online is proving to be very, very popular at the moment, because with lockdown, buyers are sat at home, they are online and they're looking at cars. So you can understand some of the frustration they might be feeling that they've found the car they want to buy and they want to speak to someone immediately about it, but a lot of the staff are on furlough, and the staff, certainly with Nathan's business, some of them are working from home and are fielding these inquiries. So it's so important, and this is what all dealers are saying, it's so important to just keep that dialogue going, and hopefully customers will understand that. A lot of them are working on, with very small teams at the moment.
Absolutely. And there was another story that kind of went into a little bit more sort of detail and more sort of thought leadership around it, and that was on Bloomberg.com, and it was shared on mine and Mike Jones's LinkedIn pages. And there's been some interesting comments around it, and a fairly common thought really is that around, we saw pre-lockdown around some activity in certain areas where people moved away from public transport to buy cars again, because they just didn't want to be using public transport, and they went out to purchase not necessarily an expensive car, but they did go out to buy a car that they owned as an alternative to public transport. And they're saying that potentially will happen again on the back end of this, that actually a percentage, there's been a few surveys done as well in the market, that a percentage of consumers that don't actually own a car now will go out into the market to purchase a car again from owning one previously and not using it because they went over to public transport and shared ownership of vehicles and mobility services, and they're going to move back to owning a vehicle in the short term as to keep away from public transport. And they're talking about personal mobility rather than shared transportation, and it's obviously high on people's agenda during this lockdown period, and you'll see this sort of appear possibly as we come out at the back end of this around the restrictions on social distancing. There'll be germophobia still, with people as well to keep away. So you can see this kind of having a bit of a stimulus within the car market as we come out.
Yeah, and in fact, over the last week or so, there's been a couple of stories kicking around about a rise in searches for sub £10,000 cars. So these are buyers, thinking along those lines and probably wanting a sort of cheap and cheerful alternative to public transport.
Yeah, definitely. And then moving on to finance now, and there has been a couple of updates. So yesterday, before this podcast, one that the one we're referring to has appeared in the Financial Times, and this is UK Car Finance Group's report surge in motorists seeking loan relief, and this comes alongside an announcement from the FCA as well, actually looking at a 3-month finance deferment suggestion. So you can see where people are now in the automotive. They've got loans on their vehicles and looking at sort of help on that. And in the financial report, they do talk about calls to lenders rising by 20-30 times the typical level, and that's according to the FLA, as people look to find a way of stalling payments and taking a holiday on their car loan payments.
Yeah, and some of the figures here are quite astonishing. So during the first week of the lockdown, there was something like 1,400% increase in the number of calls from concerned customers to their lenders, and this rose by 200% during the second week of the lockdown. So there's obviously a lot of concern out there, and the FCA move, if it does happen to put a 3-month repayment pause in, would help a lot of consumers out there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we know that there is sort of in excess of 80% of new car sales are now done under PCP in the private ownership side of things. So there is a call there that a lot of drivers, and bearing in mind the timing of I think you mentioned it on one of the previous podcasts. The timing of this have been in March. This would have been a time where people did take out PCP 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and we'll be coming to the end of that PCP term, and there'll be a lot of questions as what do they do, because normally they would either switch the car and get another car, or they'd look for a loan to pay off the guaranteed future value of that vehicle, and they're at this point in time where they haven't got that option at the minute, have they? Because there's no activity taking place. So again, you can understand the feeling with this one, and we have actually got as next week Adrian Daly from the FLA hopefully joining a VRA webinar to talk through some of this, and I'll hopefully be posing some questions about his thoughts into some of the numbers within this report as well. So stay tuned for that one, and hopefully we can maybe we'll try and get Adrian on the show at one point as well. Curtis, that would be great if we can get Adrian on.
Yeah, most definitely. So next headline is from Motor Trader, and it's car gurus pull the plug on businesses in Germany, Spain and Italy. So this is based on a statement put out by car gurus last week, and it really has cited the COVID-19 crisis, and basically saying that they will be concentrating in terms of their international markets on the UK and Canada, and will be winding down operations in Germany, Spain and Italy, and also halting any expansion efforts in any new international markets. So this is really quite significant. I mean, car gurus, we know, are massive in the US. The UK and Canada were the first businesses outside of the US to be launched, and Germany was very much the springboard into continental Europe. And I remember having conversations with Langley Steinert, the founder of Car Gurus, when they first launched in the UK, and that was very much part of the game plan. So obviously some rethinking going on there.
Yeah, and you can kind of understand it, but I didn't I mean, I didn't see that one coming, did you? I mean, it was, that's a little bit out of the blue in terms of that classified market and the impact that that's having. But you can see where, we've had the announcement this week with Auto Trader, and I suspect others will follow, where since the announcement of the additional lockdown, they have obviously extended their support to the dealer network, and it's helping the dealer network in terms of cash flow and maintaining their sort of money. But again, it's costing these businesses a lot of money in terms of lost revenue as well. So you can see where it's impacting. But yeah, I mean, because they have expanded, they've been pushing hard, as you say, in those intercontinental areas. And we thought Germany was obviously the big one, wouldn't we? I mean, that was a big scoop for them when they entered Germany, and for them to make the decision to start to wind Germany down along with Spain and Italy. I mean, that's just not one that we saw coming. So again, we'll have to see what comes from them focusing their efforts on the UK and Canada. But I suspect it has a little bit of doubt on them as a business. But again, it's still early days, aren't we, through this?
So you're listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group, the only weekly podcast serving the car retailing sector, and available online at motortraderadio.com and by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Deezer, and SoundCloud.
So moving over to Auto Retail Agenda, and a little bit of a sort of a nudge there from Marshall's CEO Dash Gupta, and he's talking about about this urge, the spirit of lockdown, and I think everybody's been talking about this, haven't they? That it's a case of if we're in lockdown, then let's respect that, and the quicker everybody respects it and adheres to it, the quicker we'll be through this, and that tends to be the general view. The quicker we get through it, we're out the other end, we've got control of it, got the measures in place, we can start to sort of focus on exit strategies. But again, he's had a comment in there that said to the businesses selling but not delivering, in line with the spirit of the government lockdown guidance, and that non-essential servicing work has also been ceased. And he's quoted here to say that he told Auto Retail Live that there was consensus from the most fellow retailers who speak on a twice weekly calls with the NFDA, that despite the wording of the guidance allowing others, such as the BVLA, to make another judgment. And I think it's probably hinting at some of the grey area with this, and it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because we've talked about it numerous times on the show that the government are moving at such a fast rate. There isn't that much fine detail behind some of the guidance that they're giving, is there? And people are trying to look for ways around it, if that's the best way of putting it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are so many grey areas here, but what Dash says does make perfect sense. I mean, okay, carry on selling, but you can't deliver cars at the moment. That is sort of widely accepted in the sector, which is why the announcement from the BVRLA was a bit puzzling, because they were urging a return to deliveries. So this one's going to play out. I'm sure we'll be revisiting it again fairly soon.
Yeah, because it takes people, whatever, in terms of movement of vehicle, handover of vehicles, it's people that are involved with this, and that's what we're trying to protect, as customers as well as colleagues, and doing it, as everybody said right from the start, do the right thing, and that's do the right thing by your customers, but also do the right thing especially for your colleagues. And the more you sort of put these things out, it creates this expectation that why you not collecting our vehicles, why you not delivering our vehicles, etc. Then there's a bit behind this. But interestingly, I mean, Dash does go on to say that the inquiries are 90% down, but it's still selling around 40 cars a day. So again, supporting what we were talking about earlier about the consumers at the back end of this. There's still activity taking place, albeit a lot lower than what it would normally be. But we're in an area that Dash is talking about in that used to new ratio
Yeah, that's
1.7
changed somewhat.
to 1, has leapt to 8.7 used cars to every 1 new car. So it's it's not a KPI that you would normally see, is it, in the market? But again, we are in unusual times, so you are going to get a little bit of this. But again, great quote there from Dash, talking about about selling and not delivering, and urging stay in the spirit of lockdown, which is what the government are saying.
Yeah, now the next story, we mentioned this at the beginning of the show. It's from Autocar, and the headline is Vauxhall Boss, Coronavirus will change car buying for good. So this is an interview that Vauxhall CEO Stephen Norman did with Steve Cropley at Autocar, and it's actually a really interesting sort of insider account on what some of the OEMs are thinking at the moment. So Stephen Norman, we're all talking about the shift to online, but this perspective from Stephen Norman is the importance of going back to basics and using the phone more. So he's saying that he believes the lockdown is encouraging car buyers to embrace a new phone-based direct sales system which Vauxhall has launched, and it's actually rushed it into place. So it must have been in the pipeline. They've brought it forward, and he's confident it will remain effective long after business returns to normal. So he's saying that there's currently around 12,000 cars in the Vauxhall pipeline. So that's between the production line and dealers, a figure which he says is unusually low for obvious reasons. But he's saying that Vauxhall is seeing more interaction with customers over the phone and is able to talk to them over the phone about the supply of these cars. And he really sort of indicates that this could be the way forward. And he does actually single out Jim Palace dealerships, which he reckons are already on overtime. So it goes back to what we've said before on the podcast about it's that the importance of that communication between the customer and the dealer. It doesn't have to be face to face. It can be over the phone.
No, and you can see this. I mean, he's talking about spending 2 hours a day personally answering calls from potential new Vauxhall customers, which great work there by Stephen, in terms of what he's doing there. But again, like you say, it's kind of that online area that, as you say, nobody really talks about, do they? That the telephone, that conversation, and talking back about the COVID-19 and social distancing, lockdown. Sorry, not lock-in. Probably a lot of people are in lock-ins as well as lockdowns. But it is that communication, talking to somebody, and you can see where this has hit right at the right time. Having the conversation. It's not all about online through chat bots, etc. That there is a conversation with somebody over the phone, and maybe that is the missing element, as you say, that we need to think about in terms of this online process. But again, quite a broad statement there from Stephen, that it will change for good, and I think that's the key message that seems to be coming out of this. And Nathan said the same, and again Darren on his interview said the same, that there will be learnings and there will be change of behaviours out of the back end of this. There will be new learnings from this, unlike anything else we've been through, and that's probably the key with this, isn't it? I think from what I'm saying.
In all the interviews we've done over the last 2 or 3 weeks, that really has been the sort of key message, that car retailing will look quite different once the lockdown's lifted and we start selling cars again. It won't go back to the way it was.
No, exactly. And then moving over into the European market a little bit, just here as we move towards the end, but the interesting one that we got sight of this week was in Automotive News Europe, and this is where you can sort of see what is starting to happen within the OEM world and about the production plants and the restart of some of these production plants. So Automotive News Europe have produced the latest on plant reopening dates, and they do keep updating it because things are changing. Every time there's an announcement, then obviously the OEMs sat in those countries will look at changing what they're doing. But they go into a little bit of detail around what's happening with people like Aston Martin, that they're extending production stoppages at its 2 UK factories until April the 27th. BMW plants in Munich, Dingolf Link, I can't even say that one, and the others. I won't try and pronounce all the others, but they're talking about May the 4th as an opening. So not long before some of these OEMs start to think about reopening some of their production plants.
Yeah, I don't know if we're working from the same list, but it does suggest on my list that Mini production in Oxford could restart on May the 4th.
Yeah, and there's a few others, but one that we've sort of focused on a little bit was probably closer to home, and that's the Swindon operation for Honda, isn't it? That we know that Swindon is on a strategic shutdown plan. And in this report, they do say that Honda said that the reopening of its plant in Swindon, England, will depend on the advice from government and health authorities, as well as market and supply conditions. So fairly vague in terms of their plans around what will be happening for Honda there.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to keep an eye on because, as you mentioned, the plant is due to close next year, and Honda must be running the rule over the business at the moment and seeing what the value is in reopening after the lockdown and then closing early part of next year. It's a real dilemma there.
And Nissan production in Sunderland, they're talking about, again, similar to others, about a restart of April the 27th, and there was a report that was out that the automakers' vehicle and assembly plants in Barcelona remain closed until further notice. So again, different strategic opening plans depending on the country that these manufacturers operate within as well. So they are really trying to adhere to government guidelines in the relevant countries, aren't they?
Yeah, and the final story this week actually comes from ASEA, which is the European trade association for car manufacturers, and the headline is passenger car registrations down 25.6% during the first quarter of 2020 and down 55.1% in March. So this is really showing the impact of the lockdown across the different European markets. So no big surprises, but still pretty scary seeing those figures.
It is, isn't it? I mean, interesting though, the report obviously doesn't include the UK now either. So obviously UK is sat outside the EU there, and obviously, as we know, UK performed at 44.4% down in the month of March, and that takes a year-to-date down of 31%. But you can see where that sort of year-to-date impact has hit some of the bigger countries. So if you compare with somewhere like Germany, so Germany down 20% year to date, and it hit them minus 37.7% in March alone. And then you've obviously got Spain there, 31% for the year to date, but actually hit them by 69.3% in March. So hit Spain very, very hard in March itself. So you can see France there, 72.2% down in March. And that takes them down to 34.1% as a year to date. But the report does go into some detail, and it'd be worth heading over to the website and have a look, because what they do is they break it down by each of the OEM groups in terms of the March and year-to-date performance, and you can start to see where the VW group, and this is obviously in terms of the European market for them, it hit them 46.2% in March and takes them down to a 19.1% year-to-date compared to last year. But compare them with someone like the PSA group, obviously including sort of Peugeot, Opel, Vauxhall, Citroën and the DS, it takes them down to 32.1% as a year to date, and hit the group overall 68.1% in the month of March. So you can see where the absolutely huge impact this has had on some of the manufacturers. And we were talking about Honda before. Honda felt the pain a little bit in March at 67.5% down, but it actually takes them down to a 41.8% year-to-date drop. So hit them pretty hard, I think, in the so far this year.
Yeah, I've seldom seen a column with so many minuses. The only pluses for Porsche, which was actually up 24%, which is actually quite remarkable, and DS up 31.4% for year to date.
Yeah, again, there is say some positives in there, but not as many, is there?
Not many. No, that's it.
You can see those that the manufacturers that have had some some growth in the first sort of 2 months of the year, and so the overall impact of March hasn't hit them as bad as some of the others in terms of the year-to-date performance. But again, you can see the pain there, so it's worth having a look over at that website and have a look at some of the detail there. And say we're in unprecedented times, aren't we? So it's very difficult to do any like-for-like comparisons that these figures don't skew, but ones are worth watching.
Yeah, well, that really brings us to a close, doesn't it, Phil?
I think it does. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of stories out there, and there's a lot happening. So worth heading over to keep an eye on a lot of the websites there that we've mentioned. There's a lot of webinars taking place as well, and it's very difficult to try and keep on top of some of these webinars because some of them do they sort of diarise at the same time as others, so you're trying to sort of pick which ones you're on and catch up with them. But obviously try and keep abreast of everything. There's a lot going on, but it's great that everything's been shared at these times.
Yeah, and these webinars seem to be clashing with Zoom meetings as well.
Yes, they do. Yeah. There's a lot going on, but your Teams now you can do you can play about with the backgrounds now on Teams as well as you can on Zoom there, so that keeps everybody quite entertained on conference calls that you have internally and with customers. So you can actually look like you are actually in your office or on the beach somewhere as well. So
yes.
Yeah, and I shouldn't say that when I'm meant to be in Nerca, Spain this weekend, but maybe not.
Well, that's it for this week. You've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Many thanks for tuning in. Do join us again next weekend, and also look out for our special interviews during the week. Until then, stay tuned for a special interview we recorded earlier in the week with Nathan Tomlinson, DP and owner of Devonshire Motors. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Hello and welcome from me, Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, to the special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Many thanks again for joining us to the latest in our series of special interviews with industry leaders during this COVID-19 crisis. Following recent conversations with Sytner Group CEO Darren Edwards, Virtue Motors CEO Robert Forrester, IMDA's chairman Umesh Samani and ASE's chairman Mike Jones. All of these will still be available to stream online from motortraderadio.com, Spotify and Apple and Google Podcasts.
So our special guest today is Nathan Tomlinson, dealer principal and owner of the multi-award winning Devonshire Motors, the Barnstaple-based Mitsubishi dealership. Welcome to the podcast, Nathan.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, first time.
Very much so, yeah. Thank you.
So, a lot going on, isn't there?
There most certainly is, yeah. Where do we begin?
Well, that's it. I mean, it's a pleasure, I say, to have you on board, and just to start off by giving us a little bit of background on you and your business, and take us through some of the situation you found yourself in when we sort of went into the lockdown stage.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we're a Mitsubishi dealer in Barnstaple, North Devon. Over 30 years as a Mitsubishi dealer. Single site operation, but our business model packs a pretty decent punch, typically around 6 to 10% market share with Mitsubishi, overhead absorption of over 100%. Under normal circumstances, it's a really strong model, and of course being small means we're nimble. Did we feel nimble the last couple of weeks? Not really, no. Closing down the showroom was quite a straightforward task. After sales proved a little more tricky because mainly customers and staff, the range of responses we had was completely different. Some people acting like nothing was happening, and others literally almost fearing for their lives. And that's probably been the hardest part of the last couple of weeks, just balancing that complete spectrum of human response. Kind of like politics and religion. The coronavirus has taken a position alongside those two in terms of, really eliciting such emotional responses from people, and also such different responses from people. So we've kind of moved through the same processes that everybody else has in terms of closing the showroom, thinking we were going to stay open in after sales, then realising we weren't. But the hard part all the way through has been communicating clearly, and that's something that we've found really, really difficult.
So, Nathan, what's the status now with the business? For instance, how many staff are on furlough? You mentioned just then about you thought about keeping after sales open, but you haven't. Who's manning the phones, and who's responding to internet inquiries at the site?
So it was more a case of we hoped initially that we'd be able to keep some after-sales momentum going, and it very quickly became apparent that we couldn't. Number one, in order to protect staff and customers, of course, but number two, just because the practicality of safe working practice with any number of people is really, really difficult. Across the business, we've got quite a large body shop operation that kind of mirrors the size of the dealership. We've got about 55 employees in total, and we've got 19 that are currently active, so everybody else furloughed. Now, probably 2 years ago, we changed our admin structure, moving away from kind of typical sales and service admin to a sort of centralised structure where we've got a core of people that deal with almost everything that's non-skill specific, so phone calls, emails, web lead first responses, basic invoicing, sales orders, all the kind of CRM stuff that doesn't require that ultra specific skill set that either a salesperson's got or a service advisor or a technician. So by keeping 2 or 3 of those people active rather than furloughed, we've actually got a really good, strong core of people that are able to manage any kind of incoming inquiry to the website and deal with it to a point. Beyond that, then we've got 3 technicians, our after-sales manager and a service advisor who are also active. And at the moment, they're a kind of working from home scramble team. And they've been in half a dozen times to do NHS critical work, vets. They've changed brake pads, tyres, dealt with oil leaks, all the kind of things that crop up regularly in normal day-to-day and seem like kind of run-of-the-mill stuff. But actually, when it's frontline specific, becomes quite, important.
And just following up on one of the points you made there, Nathan, in terms of incoming inquiries, what sort of level are you getting at the moment, and have you had over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, so initially it was really quite interesting because, that scramble to close the business, it's really non-specific. So you kind of think of the obvious things. You draw all the obvious processes to a close. It seems quite straightforward. And then, to use Robert Forrester's phrase from one of your previous podcasts, you go home and have your tea, and you realise that service reminders are still going out, or a marketing initiative you set up a month ago is due to go out in 3 days' time. Yeah. So we had to change quite a lot of our communication, our outgoing automated communication, so that it made sense. What that did was allowed us to communicate quite clearly with customers more and more as time went on. So initially we saw a lot of inquiries what about MOT, what about the service I've got booked next week, all those typical customer questions. But as more and more of our automated materials went out, and we updated a very specific page on our website, the information we were sending became more and more consistent, and those type of inquiries died away. So what we're kind of left with now is the genuine, urgent repair, frontline worker style inquiries, and or sales inquiries, which we're managing by rapport building and continuing conversations just as we normally would.
So in terms of, we were talking before the show, and we're talking about obviously this sort of home working, remote working. What's a typical day now for you at the minute as a business? Because like you said right at the start, even though you're a single site, you do punch very heavy, don't you, in terms of what you do. So what's a typical day now for you in your business?
Well, I normally get up around 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Have a bit of lunch, watch some afternoon telly. Yeah. G&T start about 4, do they? Yeah.
Well, joking aside, I try to keep it as consistent with a normal day at work as possible. So I'm up at, like many of us are in this industry, 5:30, 6 o'clock. And what I try to do, for me personally, I'll be working on some project or something for the business that I try to do ahead of the day-to-day stuff that comes in around 8, 9, 10 o'clock when everybody else starts working. So at the moment, it's refining our website so that we've got, we were talking earlier about, it's not so much buy online, it's rapport build online. So I'll work on those kind of things in the morning, and then during the day, as conversations pick up between staff members and customers, then it'll be a mix of calls, response coaching, and then just generally trying to second guess what's going to happen next and have a plan in place for it. And then from that, trying to feed that down subtly to our team, because one thing that I've been guilty of, and can happen very easily at the moment, is you make a decision and then 30 seconds later you've got to try to explain to half a dozen people why you're trying to reverse it and almost do completely the opposite. So, some subtle communication during the day is also very important.
Now, Nathan, over the last couple of weeks, we've heard from the bosses of Virtue and Sitner about how they went into lockdown. So I'm kind of interested on what the ramifications of the lockdown were for you as a Solus site, especially in terms of cash flow, because that's the common denominator, isn't it? It doesn't matter how big or small the business is. And also, have suppliers been receptive to things like deferred payments?
So something that's quite interesting for us there is that we're on 90-day terms with insurance companies in the body shop. So actually, we've still got some money coming in. That's probably quite unique to us, and it will obviously create an equal problem the other side, because we'll be waiting that same period of time. The thing that I think is important to perhaps keep in mind with cash flow and suppliers is you've got to be mindful and have some empathy, because they're in a very similar position to us. So in fact, we've actually brought forward some supplier payments where they're small companies, or, all of us work with great people. And the last thing that we want on the other side of this is to have broken a relationship, or, I've heard a lot of dealers stopping, direct debits for the coffee machine, the music on hold, all those systems, the websites. It won't go on. This won't go on forever. And at the end of the day, £200, £500, £700 a month payments aren't going to be what make or break a business. It's the big costs, and of course, cash flow is a massive concern. And initially, for the most part, for us anyway, that's because, furloughed or not, until that HMRC portal's up and running, we're still paying wages. And the key factor there is, how big is your wage bill? How long have you got to pay it for before you're likely to get some of it back? And do we really know exactly how much of it we're going to get back? And it's making those decisions for the right reasons in the meantime, and the right reasons is really key for that, because if you think about a scenario where this only lasts for a month against one that lasts for 6 months, you're going to make a very different decision. So you can easily look at, most businesses will be able to look after everybody the way they'd want to for a month or two. And that's going to be completely different if this goes on for 6 or 12 months, of course.
Yeah.
So it's about making a balanced decision. You can't just switch everything off and kind of hope for the best.
Yeah, it's that impact into, like you say, on the supply chain of things as well. Those, because these guys, they are, small businesses that if everybody did it, then you've got a risk of those guys going into liquidation, and then when you do get up and running again, then you haven't got that supplier because of the ramifications of cancelling direct debits. But again, as you say there, between that balance of doing the right thing, but actually having a business in the long term for people to come back to, it's a tough balance to manage that one, isn't it?
I think if there's one thing I'd like to see the other side of this, it's that we come out of it more or less the same as we went in. So we've all got pain and we've all got concerns, but at the end of the day, I think anybody would say I'd rather be back to where I was with the problems I had, a month or 2 months ago, i.e. missing my Q1 target, 20 cars over 90 days, whatever your problems were before, you kind of want to come out the same the other side. And if you've burnt all these suppliers, and the other thing is, of course, employee goodwill. The day we restart normality, or whatever that period of transition is, we're going to be depending so heavily on people, our own people, to work extra hours perhaps, to work harder, to work faster. And if you've burnt that goodwill over the period of a month or two, just through trying to protect cash flow, which of course is critical, but you're making, again, it's got to be that balanced decision, otherwise you're going to burn the goodwill that you need to recover from this. So it's the short term, but it's also the long term.
Definitely. And on that note, in terms of the OEMs manufacturer, and you're obviously with Mitsubishi, how are they supporting? Because I've heard, in terms of conversations that there's a lot of, we referred to it on Darren Edwards' interview with the WhatsApp group between that sort of the manufacturers started, OEM started, and then it got took over by sort of the CEOs and business heads. But how were Mitsubishi throughout this process with yourself? Because you obviously do operate very closely with them as an OEM.
Yeah, and have done for a long time. But with Mitsubishi, you've got to remember that they're an importer. So almost like a big dealer group head office in many ways, and they have their own business to balance too. But with that said, they've put together a suite of solid support measures, as have many other manufacturers. But I think for me, it's a little bit bigger than Mitsubishi and us. The scale and effect of what's going on at the moment, I think, requires more of a collaborative approach. One of the things I've noticed quite a lot is that, dealers will phone each other, and then manufacturers will phone dealers, and there's a lot of conversation about, what's person A doing, what's person B doing, what do you think we should do? And actually, going back to that WhatsApp group you've mentioned, that's the way I think we need to be approaching the current situation. Don't think we should be getting too excited about Q2 targets until we've figured out whether we're going to be in Q2 or not. So for me, it comes down to putting together, the key players in this: manufacturers, lenders, the group CEOs, and then also, the likes of the IMDA, the NFDA, and get a broad representation to put something a little bit more across the board in place, rather than, playing person A off against person B, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Now, Nathan, you won't need reminding that the lockdown happened during the worst possible month for dealers. So just on a sort of practical level, how did you go about facilitating new orders that were already in the pipeline? And also, what have you done with part exchanges that you took during the first half and 3/4 of the month?
So we've got 3 new cars that we haven't been able to hand over, and so when you finish laughing about that, It's not because we only sold 5.
I'm glad you clarified that.
It's your fault for the 44% drop in March, then, is it, Nathan?
Our Q1 focus has always been the same, and that's work mid-February towards a first week of March handover, because it's always been an issue in the industry in terms of selling cars and handing them over quickly. So we've always worked towards that with our marketing, with our events. Our entire, structure is geared up to making sure we sell or take orders in February for March plate, but then we get those vehicles out in as many days as it takes to load the showroom and get them all out quickly. So typically we haven't had too much hangover to deal with. We had a really good March, really strong March. In fact, I think we were something in the region of 17% market share. Wow. For a manufacturer that's got, less than 1% nationally. So for us, that hasn't been so much of a big deal. In terms of the used part exchanges, we were cautious anyway because we had a lot of stock around us. But with that said, it was nice to see the commentary from CAP, and also our online activity. There certainly doesn't seem to be any need for dealers to erode used car pricing. No reason at all. I think the trade might feel differently in terms of anybody that's got to liquidate stock. But with that said, there is no way to liquidate stock at the moment anyway, so it's almost an irrelevant point.
No, very true. I mean, it's that when there's transactions not taking place in any scale, then, like you say, it shouldn't really affect anything. It's going to be
there's almost no barometer for it.
Yeah,
So, I mean, our customer inquiries, where we have had inquiries, they haven't been price led in any way. They've just been for need or interest. As I say, I think it would be different if auction sites were open and dealers were looking at their stock in a traditional way and saying, okay, it's coming up to 60 days or 90 days, so I'm going to have to dispose of it. I think that would be different, but as you say, it's not. So
yeah, I mean, that's going to be the challenge when when restrictions are lifted and everything, whenever does start to come back out at the other end, is the balance between maintaining those pricing in line with the market, but actually balancing that against those in a need of cash and trying to maintain that equilibrium between the two, because it's going to be a tough one, because some businesses will be in a worse state in terms of cash flow than others, won't they?
Of course.
And that's where it starts. Not just dealers, you're talking vendors, lease, contract hire, etc. That's totally different, but interesting. And in terms of, you mentioned it before about collaboration, and you've got two kind of social media messages, themes running at the minute. One is obviously around the staying safe and keeping everyone safe and well, and the second one is obviously around the collaboration, dealers, OEMs, finance houses, suppliers. And you just talk us through what you why you set that up that way, and what you are messaging there, if it's not too obvious.
In terms of the collaboration, kind of just what we touched on before, I just think, from my experience and from the dealers I've been talking to in the last couple of weeks, and that's from a scale of kind of owner, driver, single site to perhaps dealers with small groups, and many of them sharing exactly the same concerns, always the same questions, and it's the same 3 or 4 questions, every time. And the big groups and some of the manufacturers got a better grasp of how to deal with these things. And I think the situation dictates being a little bit more serious than perhaps we initially thought it was going to be 3 weeks ago. I think the situation dictates a kind of a bigger picture approach to supporting and helping each other. We've mentioned the IMDA and the NFDA, great organisations, but they don't pull individuals together enough at times like this. And I think there's a lot of information around that would be better digested and kind of recycled into a more dealer-friendly terminology, because a lot of dealers have grown up just doing what they know best, selling cars, the basics. And when it comes to critical business management, they don't have the resource, they don't have the the people to lean on. It's hard for some people to know which way to turn.
Yeah, because they've just been working in their little silo, haven't they, in their area, and some of them, I know it from speaking to a lot of these independent guys that they don't know what's happening out there because they're just getting on with their daily job that they need to do. Whether that's looking after the customer, selling a car, or going out sourcing cars and looking after the website. They're kind of cocooned a little bit from the wider market, aren't they, in many ways?
And being in your bubble can be very successful. But when things around you dynamically change, then it's hard to know who to turn to for clear advice and guidance. And there's plenty of good sources out there, don't get me wrong, but not everybody's connected to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, following up on that point, Nathan, I mean, clearly you're talking to a lot of dealers, be they local or national. I don't know if you're talking to any independents at the moment, but how would you describe the mood amongst other dealers is at the moment?
If you'd have asked me this a week ago, I would have said utter panic, because, for everybody, it was a case of how do we deal with the immediate cash flow issue that's going to be right around the corner. But actually, I think it's kind of changing now to many people understanding that it's not quite as bad as it seemed in terms of there is a lot of government support available. Some of it now is becoming more factual because initially there wasn't enough guidance available for people to feel comfortable, but there is now. Yeah. So I think it's calmed down a lot, but it's difficult for most dealers. I think it's fair to say it's difficult for most dealers to separate fact from opinion. And I think that's interesting because, if you look, if you were to be able to jump in a time machine and go back 50 years, when your newspaper came once a week, you lived and died by the headline, and it was the gospel. The problem is now we've all got so many different variations on what we perceive to be news, and it can be very easy for somebody's opinion to look like fact. So I think that's a really important takeaway point. We really need to find a method to clearly communicate across the industry a kind of best practice plan for shutdown first, for HR, for survival, and then to thrive the other side of it. I think that's something together.
Yeah, and during this process, have you found social media useful?
That's a double-edged question.
I'm thinking more in terms of. I'm thinking in terms of, say, LinkedIn, where a lot of dealers are on LinkedIn, and I'm certainly seeing a lot of best practices, and indeed, if they're doing anything for key workers, they're putting postings on. So, is there anything in there that's actually been useful?
Absolutely, yeah, no, absolutely, very much so. I think our industry in particular is a big fan of shared best practice, isn't it? Nobody really does anything particularly original. You either do it better or worse than the person next to you. So social media and those good news stories are certainly very, very useful. I wouldn't say anything to the contrary.
No.
But what it can do sometimes is make it can make people feel left out a little bit, because some dealers are better at communicating in that way than others. So I think that's important to be mindful of.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've touched on it before about you mentioned it around the cap values and the fact that they took a pragmatic view of freezing them when obviously there was no transactions. Is that kind of the feeling that you're hearing from across the network? Are they quite, what's the view from dealers in terms of values, or does it depend on, again, what we touched on earlier around that importance of cash flow and survival, or does it, is there a common theme across the market that you're hearing?
Yeah, I think Mike Jones was very clear on the fact that there's only going to be one solution to used car stock, and it's not going to be liquidation, it's going to be retail. And I think that's probably For all, when you're not trading at all, you've got none of those barometers that you usually have. So, you don't look at trade values, you're not buying and selling. So all that's kind of disappeared. And I think for dealers, the most important factor to focus on at the moment isn't the value of your stock, is it declining or not. It's about having a plan in place to get it either quickly prepared or efficiently prepared, because this will end at some point. And when it does, the difference will be those dealers that are ready to act quickly and those that are kind of like wondering what to do next. So I think more than to focus on the value, it's a case of, focus on the plan you've got in place or can put in place to recover as quickly as possible. And again, that's something we're always doing and battling in the industry, getting those used cars prepared and to forecourt or internet as quickly as possible.
And Nathan, to finish off with, how do you think car retailing will change once the lockdown is lifted? What sort of long-lasting changes and ramifications do you foresee?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thing that interests me is that fundamentally over all the years we've been doing this, it hasn't really changed much at all. I mean, the internet came and went. It didn't go, did it? But, the fuss over the internet, disruptors in the industry. We almost every month in this industry, we deal with an almost drastic business changing scenario, but actually doesn't change much at all. I think the interesting thing with this is it will introduce people to online that wouldn't have otherwise been introduced to online. So taking us for an example, if you were to come in and buy a car from us, you'll probably see the same salesperson that you saw for your last 3 or 4 purchases, and you're familiar, you're comfortable, you're not looking for a change in that experience. But being forced to take your buying process online and then finding out that actually it's the same person, and he's just as entertaining electronically as he is in person, and then perhaps further down the line he's going to come out to you with the car as well. That person that wouldn't have otherwise looked to online is now going to realise that actually online is better. So I think fundamentally that will change the way consumers look at online retailing through dealerships. Equally, I think for salespeople that typically would see online inquiries as almost an out-of-hours chore, they're going to start to understand through experience that it's actually not quite as onerous as it appears. It's 5 or 10 minutes on your smartphone, and actually it's quite satisfying, because there's nothing worse for a sales executive than phoning somebody 3 to 5 times a day and getting hung up on because it's an inconvenient time and somehow that doesn't register. Whereas when the guy contacts you at 9 o'clock at night, he couldn't be happier that you've responded to him, and the conversation is completely different. So I think it'll be a game changer for online, and I think it needs to be, but I think it'll be for the good.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, all I need to say now is many thanks for taking the time out and joining us today, Nathan. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thanks for sharing your experiences and obviously insights with us and our listeners. So it only leaves me to say that, wish you and the team of Devonshire Motors all the best through these difficult and unprecedented, and for the overused word, times that we find ourselves in, and fingers crossed that we'll return to some kind of new normality soon enough, and you can get back to doing what you do best, really. So it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, Nathan.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you found it interesting.
Yeah, many thanks, Nathan. Thanks for joining us there. So that's all for now. You've been listening to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Please like and share on social media, as it's important during these times, as Nathan pointed out, for the dealer community to actually come together and share their experiences. So Philip and I will be back with the industry headlines on Saturday, but do watch out for more special podcast interviews as we work through this crisis. Thank you for tuning in and stay safe.